history records a battle of the Diablo Mountains, October 3, 1854. A brief, violent skirmish between the U.S. Army and the Lipan Apache. It is a footnote in the long, bloody story of the American West, a single entry in the ledger of a brutal century. But legend, carried on whispers from the Texas Hill Country, speaks of another battle, a different fight, a decade earlier. A desperate close-quarters struggle led by a man the Comanche called Brave Too Much. This is the story of that legend, a search for a forgotten battle in the canyons of a man they called Devil Jack. To find it, we must first understand the world that created him, the savage frontier of the Republic of Texas. In the early 1840s, the dominant power on the southern plains was not the fledgling Republic of Texas, nor was it Mexico. It was an empire on horseback, the Comancheria. The Comanche, or the Numununu, the people, as they called themselves, had transformed their destiny. Originally a pedestrian Shoshone tribe from the mountains, their acquisition of the horse in the late 17th century unleashed a revolution. They swept south, becoming masters of mounted warfare, a light cavalry the world had never seen. Their name, given to them by the Ute, was Comanche, anyone who wants to fight me all the time. It was a name they earned. They displaced other powerful tribes, most notably the Apache, driving them from the plains in a relentless wave of conquest and making them their mortal enemies. Their expansion halted the northward advance of the Spanish Empire, a feat few other indigenous peoples had ever achieved. This was not a confederation of scattered bands, but a true imperial power. The Comancheria was a vast territory they controlled through military might, strategic alliances, and a complex economy based on two pillars, the buffalo and the raid. The buffalo provided everything: food, shelter, and clothing. Raiding provided the rest. Comanche war parties, often striking by the light of a full moon, plunged hundreds of miles into Mexico, returning with thousands of horses, mules, and human captives. These were not just acts of war, they were the engine of an economy. The spoils traded for firearms, manufactured goods, and immense wealth. Their society was decentralized, organized into several large autonomous divisions. The southernmost of these, whose territory stretched from the Edwards Plateau to the headwaters of the Texas rivers, were the Penateca, the honey eaters. It was the Penateca who would bear the brunt of the collision with the new, encroaching power, the Republic of Texas. The Texans, like the Spanish before them, failed to grasp a critical reality of Comanche politics. A chief's authority was earned, not absolute. He could not speak for bands other than his own. This misunderstanding would prove to have catastrophic consequences. To defend its porous, violent frontier, Texas created a unique fighting force. They were not soldiers in a conventional sense. They were the Texas Rangers. Born of necessity in the 1820s, they were an irregular corps of mounted riflemen who provided their own horses, their own weapons, and their own rough-and-tumble code of discipline. They were, as one contemporary described them, men who could ride like a Mexican, trail like an Indian, shoot like a Tennessean, and fight like the devil. In 1840, leadership of the Rangers protecting the western frontier fell to a man who seemed the very antithesis of their rugged image. John Coffee Hayes was just 23 years old. He was slightly built, fair-complexioned, and quiet to the point of modesty. A fellow ranger described him as a slim, slight, smooth-faced boy, a stripling of few words. But in the crucible of combat, this unassuming youth was transformed. He was a peerless tactician, a leader of preternatural calm, and a fighter of shocking ferocity. His men, a diverse company of Anglos, Tejanos, and allied Native Americans, followed him with absolute devotion. His enemies learned to fear him above all others. To the Mexicans, his men were Los Diablos Tejanos, the Devil Texans. To the Comanche, he was simply Brave Too Much. Jack Hayes knew he could not defeat the Comanche alone. He needed an edge, an insight into his enemy's mind that no Texan possessed. He found it in an alliance born of mutual desperation, forged with the mortal enemies of the Comanche, the Lipan Apache. For centuries, the Lipan had been caught between the hammer of Spanish, then Mexican forces to the south, and the anvil of the Comanche onslaught from the north. The Comanche had driven them from their ancestral lands on the plains, and the conflict was one of bitter, existential hatred. In the Texans, the Lipan saw powerful new allies in their long war for survival. In 1838, they formalized this relationship, signing a treaty of friendship with the Republic of Texas. By 1841, Lipan warriors were riding as official scouts with ranger companies. Their contributions were invaluable, influencing the evolution of ranger tactics as much as any new weapon. They were masters of the landscape, possessing a spiritual and scientific understanding of tracking that allowed them to read the faintest signs on the earth. They were the eyes and ears of the rangers, turning a vast and hostile wilderness into a landscape they could comprehend. Hayes's most important ally was a young Lipan chief named Flaco. The two men formed a deep bond of friendship and mutual respect. Flaco became Hayes's mentor in the art of frontier warfare, teaching him the intricate tactics of the Comanche, their feigned retreats, their flanking maneuvers, and how to counter them. Hayes would later credit Flaco with saving his life on multiple occasions. It was Flaco who gave the most enduring description of the young ranger captain's singular courage. "Me and Red Wing not afraid to go to hell together," the chief once said. "Captain Jack, he's too macho bravo. He's not afraid to go to hell all by himself." This potent combination, the tactical intelligence and unparalleled tracking skills of the Lipan, guided by the brilliant leadership of Hayes, created a new kind of fighting force. But to be truly effective against the lords of the plains, they would need one more thing: a revolution in firepower. The stage was set for a new, more violent chapter in the war for Texas, and the spark that would ignite it was about to be struck in a stone building in San Antonio. By 1840, the Texas frontier was a powder keg. The Penateca Comanche, ravaged by disease and pressed by their enemies, sought peace. The Texans, guided by President Mirabeau Lamar's harsh policy of expulsion or extermination, demanded the unconditional return of all white captives. The two worlds, with their irreconcilable views on power, treaties, and honor, were about to collide. The spark would be struck in San Antonio. On March 19, 1840, a delegation of 65 Penateca Comanche, including 12 prominent chiefs, arrived in San Antonio for peace talks. They came under what they believed was a flag of truce, a sacred immunity for ambassadors. They brought with them a single white captive, a 16-year-old girl named Matilda Lockhart. Her condition was appalling. She had been horribly tortured, her body covered in sores, and her nose burned away. The sight of the girl and her stories of other captives still held enraged the Texan commissioners. They demanded the immediate release of all prisoners. The Comanche chief Muckwarua explained that the other captives were held by different bands, over whom he had no authority. The Texans, either unable or unwilling to comprehend the decentralized nature of Comanche society, saw this as duplicity. They declared the chiefs would be held hostage until the other captives were freed. To the Comanche, this was the ultimate betrayal. An attempt to seize peace envoys was an unthinkable act of treachery. They drew their knives and tried to fight their way out. The Texans, with soldiers already in position, responded with a volley of gunfire. The fight spilled into the plaza outside. When the smoke cleared, 35 Comanches were dead, including all 12 chiefs. The remaining 29 women and children were taken prisoner. 7 Texans had been killed. The council house fight was over. For the Comanche, it was not a battle, but a massacre, an act that would be answered, not with words, but with fire and blood. The Comanche response was unlike anything Texas had ever seen. A great war chief of the Penateca, Buffalo Hump, gathered warriors from across the Comancheria. In August 1840, he led a massive war party, perhaps 1,000 strong, on a great retaliatory raid. It was the largest raid ever mounted by Native Americans on white cities in the United States. They bypassed Austin and San Antonio, sweeping down the Guadalupe Valley to the coast, a distance of over 200 miles. They sacked the town of Victoria, killing settlers and capturing over 1,500 horses. Then they descended on Linville, the second largest port in the Republic. They plundered the warehouses and homes, then burned the town to the ground as the terrified residents watched from boats in the bay. Laden with plunder, captives, and a herd of over 3,500 horses, the Great War Party turned back toward their home on the plains. But word had spread. Militias from Gonzales and Bastrop, along with Texas Ranger companies, including one with Jack Hayes, gathered to intercept them. They met near a stream called Plum Creek.
The Battle of Plum Creek was a sprawling 15-mile running fight. The Comanche, encumbered by their loot, fought a series of rear guard actions to protect their families and their captured wealth. It was here that Jack Hayes first distinguished himself in a major engagement. He noticed the Comanche warriors were expertly using their rawhide shields to deflect the Texans' single-shot rifle balls. During a lull, he advised his comrades to hold their fire during the Comanche charge, wait until the warriors had loosed their arrows and wheeled their ponies to retreat, and then fire into their exposed backs. The tactic worked. The Texans claimed a major victory, reporting over 80 Comanche killed with only one of their own lost. In reality, the Comanche escaped with the majority of their captives and horses, but the psychological blow of the Council House fight had been answered in kind. The war for Texas had entered a new, more brutal phase. In this escalating war, the Texans were at a distinct disadvantage. The Comanche warrior, with his short, powerful bow, could loose a dozen arrows in the time it took a ranger to reload his single-shot rifle. Comanche battle tactics were built around this advantage. A small group of warriors would feign an attack, drawing a volley from the Texans. Then, as the frontiersmen struggled to reload, the main Comanche force would charge, overwhelming them with a hail of arrows. But a new technology was about to change the equation of frontier warfare. In 1836, a Connecticut inventor named Samuel Colt patented a revolutionary firearm, the 5-shot repeating revolver. Known as the Colt Patterson, it was initially rejected by the U.S. Army as too fragile. But in 1839, the fledgling Republic of Texas Navy purchased 180 of the pistols. When the Navy was disbanded a few years later, Jack Hayes, with a keen eye for a tactical advantage, acquired the surplus weapons for his Ranger Company. The impact was immediate and profound. Hayes drilled his men relentlessly, teaching them a radical new tactic: to aim, fire, and reload from horseback. A single ranger now carried the firepower of 5 men. A company of 15 was the equivalent of a force of 75 armed with single-shot weapons. The Colt revolver nullified the Comanche's greatest advantage and allowed the Rangers to meet their enemy on their own terms, in a fluid, mounted, offensive battle. The era of dismounting to fight was over. The age of the gunslinger had begun. The Great Raid was over, but the war was not. The frontier simmered. Throughout 1841, Comanche raiding parties, driven by vengeance and necessity, struck settlements around San Antonio. In response, Captain Jack Hayes and his company, guided by their Lipan allies, became relentless hunters. In June, their hunt would lead them into the tangled canyons of the Sabinal River and into the fight that would become a dark legend. This small, vicious encounter, largely lost to history, may be the true event behind the legend of the Battle of the Diablo Mountains. It was a fight defined not by grand strategy, but by personal courage and shocking brutality. It was here, in the thorny thickets of Uvalde Canyon, that the name Devil Jack was truly earned. The folklore surrounding the name Diablo Mountains likely stems from a powerful amalgamation of events and reputations. The Rangers were known to Mexicans as Los Diablos Tejanos, or the Devil Texans. Hayes himself was called Devil Jack. On a later expedition, he would personally name a particularly difficult river the Devil's River. And in a stunning piece of oral history, a Comanche chief, years after being defeated by Hayes's revolver-armed men, recalled that his warriors died for 100 miles back towards the Devil's River. The name, therefore, is not just a place, but a metaphor for the hellish nature of the war Hayes waged in the rugged western canyons of Texas. In late June 1841, following a raid near San Antonio, Captain Hayes took to the trail. His force was small, barely a dozen rangers, but it was augmented by his crucial Lipan scouts under Chief Flacco, and according to one account, a contingent of 30 Mexican volunteers led by a Captain Flores. Their quarry was a small band of Patenca Comanche raiders. The pursuit led them west, into the labyrinthine canyons of the Sabanal and Frio rivers. This was Comanche territory, a landscape they knew intimately. Without the tracking skills of Flacco and his men, the rangers would have been lost. For days, the Lipan read the subtle language of the earth, following the raiders' trail over rock and through dense brush, until they finally located the Comanche camp. It was hidden in a dense, thorny thicket in Valdy Canyon, a natural fortress that negated the rangers' advantage on horseback and forced them into a fight on their own terms. A frontal assault would have been suicide. Instead, Hayes made a decision that defined his leadership. He would go in himself. Taking 2 of his men, he dismounted and crept into the thicket to flush the warriors out into the open, where his mounted rangers waited. But the Comanche were ready. A volley of arrows exploded from the brush. Both of Hayes's companions went down, badly wounded. An arrow sliced through Hayes's own finger. In a flash, the hunter had become the hunted. Under a hail of arrows, Hayes dragged one of his wounded men back to the edge of the thicket and to safety. But the other ranger was still inside, helpless. What happened next became the stuff of legend. Hayes grabbed a double-barreled shotgun, turned, and went back into the thicket alone. Inside, a dozen warriors waited with bows, tomahawks, and knives. Only one possessed a rifle. Hayes allowed them to close to within 15 feet. Then he rose and fired both barrels, the shotgun blast tearing through the dense brush, killing 2 warriors instantly. As the others fell back in shock, Hayes drew his pistol. Then, his shotgun empty, he did the unthinkable. He broke cover, sprinting out of the thicket to get a rifle from his men who were circling the perimeter before plunging back into the fight to continue the deadly duel. It was an act of almost suicidal bravery, a display of the quality Flacco called bravo too much. The fight was short and savage. When it was over, Hayes and his men had killed 8 Comanche warriors and captured 2 more. Miraculously, despite Hayes's companions being badly hit at the outset, the final report listed only 1 ranger wounded.